Warm welcome to everyone here today who's interested in perhaps one of the most important things that early years settings, primary schools do, and also one of the most important things that education systems are judged on worldwide: learning to read and teaching reading. As you know, the seminar is called Teaching Reading and Phonics: What Works and What Next? I'm not going to say very much at the moment. I'll do my presentation with my colleague Alice Bradbury towards the end. But the thing I want to emphasize most today is the word reconciliation. And it's a word that we used in our paper. And I think today's session is an opportunity to hear from a series of people, all of whom have huge expertise, in most cases, decades of work in the area of teaching reading. These are all people with somewhat different views, but all serious about this job of how can we best help children learn to read and how can we help teachers teach reading effectively. And so today gives us a chance to have a slightly more nuanced, if you like, some nuanced presentations, but also discussion. And I say this because most of you are probably aware that this topic can become quite heated, and especially when media organizations get involved as they try and fashion the stories in the way they do that will attract interest and sometimes even controversy. So I'm really grateful to you for joining us and for all our presenters for presenting, and indeed my colleagues Will and Monica, who behind the scenes are helping us with this. There will be a series of 10-minute presentations from our contributors. We're going to save up the questions, so please do use the Q&A, and we've got Alice Bradbury and Sinead Harmey will be trying to help me organize the questions, and so that we can try and address as many as possible of those. I'm sure you appreciate with a popular event like this, it's not always possible to get to everyone's question, but we'll do our very best. So all of us will join as a panel, hopefully round about 4:05, to address as many of your questions as we can. So without further ado, I'm going to turn to Charlotte Hacking and say, Charlotte, welcome, and we look forward to hearing your views on the topic.
Thank you, Dom. I'll just share slides and switch my camera on. So 10 minutes to talk about primary phonics isn't very much, but I am going to try and do my best to do a whistle-stop tour of what excellent practice in phonics in primary looks like. I'm the Learning and Programme Director at CLPE, and I'm going to be talking from the benefit of our 50-year history into researching what works best in the teaching of reading, and particularly early reading. And I think from a primary school perspective, what we need to understand is that at the heart of high quality teaching is the teacher as that enabling adult. It's really important that as teachers we have excellent knowledge, not just of our subject and of the curriculum, but also how learning and progress develop in our subject. And that also has to work hand in hand with an excellent knowledge of our children. We need to know what their prior knowledge and experience is. We need to know where they are now. We need to know where they need to be, and we need to know what motivates them. And as educators, it's our job to carefully plan ways to deliver learning that infuses, excites, and engages our children. And especially for progress in reading, it's really important that we have a good knowledge of children's literature and how to choose and use text to develop each and every child as a reader. Now, as leaders and as teachers, the inspection framework now requires us to ensure that early reading is given a really high profile in the curriculum. We need to know that staff are deeply aware of the key knowledge, the skills, the attitudes that are needed for every early reader to succeed, and to place those at the heart of our curriculum. It's also important that we aspire for every child to learn to read. We have that strong focus on ensuring that no child is left behind. And it's important that all of our staff are really well trained in how to teach a child to read. And again, that we are working to that clear program of phonics, ensuring that the grapheme phoneme correspondences are taught sequentially in early years and in Key Stage 1, alongside those really core skills of decoding for reading and encoding for spelling. But also what we have to remember is that we need to develop children's early reading using that balanced approach, because early reading requires the development of a really broad range of capabilities. And we know that using a number of different approaches is going to be more effective than focusing just on any single aspect of early reading. We know that promising approaches to developing early reading include storytelling, the activities to develop letter and sound knowledge, and those singing and rhyming activities that develop children's early phonological awareness. Prior to the introduction of that systematic phonics teaching, we need to make sure that we've got those activities planned to develop children's early phonological awareness and their interest in sounds. That's really likely to be beneficial as our children progress as readers. We need to remember that the goal of decoding is to find meaning, and decoding and comprehension shouldn't be separated. Learners need that sense of the rewards that meaning can bring. That's going to foster their will and persistence when things get tough. We know that high quality texts provide rich reading experiences that help to develop children's language, their comprehension, and their reading motivation. Now, our research and training at CLPE into how the teaching of phonics can be contextualized within that rich reading curriculum has led us to outline the model that you can see on screen here to support schools into that journey of reading fluency. As we know that children in reception are learning that basic phonic code and the skills of segmenting and blending. In year 1, they're introduced to the complex code. That's where they learn to take that more investigative approach to spelling patterns that are likely to be encountered in real books that they're reading. And as they move from early years into Key Stage 1, children are really beginning to master that complex orthography that defines our English language. It's one that's been richly influenced by many other languages, and therefore it's full of interesting irregularities. What we have to remember is that children are fluent readers, not just when they can read the words off the page, but also when they show understanding and comprehension as they read. That's going to be demonstrated by things like their expression and intonation, as well as the ability to discuss what they've just read. Now, what's important for me is that before launching into that program of phonics, where children are learning those grapheme phoneme correspondences and how to blend and segment, it's really important that they're engaged in the pleasures of reading, and that we as educators are fostering and supporting children's early phonological development. We're tuning them into listening to, recognizing, making, and discriminating sounds. Phonological awareness is an essential prerequisite to learning to read, and that means becoming aware of similarities and differences in sounds and their patterns, in tone, tempo, and beat, in loudness and softness, in the source of the sound and the sounds. And it's the ability to understand the structure of speech, not only its meaning, that's going to support children in that journey. Before they learn to read, they have to know that a sentence is made up of discrete words. They're demarcated by breaks. They also have to know that words themselves can be broken down into smaller parts. Syllables first, and then those very fine phonemes. And if a child's unaware that words can be subdivided in that way, teaching them phonics or the alphabetic code to enable them to read is likely to be unsuccessful. It's all of those approaches that we need to tune children into sounds and to develop that phonological awareness, getting them to listen and remember sounds, to talk about them, to play games with them, to sing rhymes and songs and to group words and objects according to sounds, to hear books read aloud and to introduce that oral blending and segmenting of sounds in words. There's also much to do with warming up children's mouths, their noses, their nasal cavities, their pharynx. all of these things contribute to fostering of the muscles and the movements that are going to foster that phonic development when they learn to pronounce and enunciate those discrete phonemes. There are many different books that support children in doing this. Just some of them are on the screen here. Books that help children tune into sounds like quiet. Books that help children with the musicality of words and rhythms like the drum. Books that tune children into rhyme and pattern like Honey for You and Honey for Me and Monster Food. Clap Clap is a brilliant one for the enunciation of words, preparing the way for the enunciation of phonemes. Books that tune into children into the specific speech sounds, Monster Clothes and Catch That Chicken, are brilliant for focusing on alliteration. And books that encourage children to do that work of segmenting and blending with words that are appropriate for that. Farm Animals by Nosy Crow is a brilliant one for that. As they move into reception, we're then looking at that systematic program of phonics, teaching the basic code. Now, if that's done well, and if that's preceded by a strong focus on early phonological development, that should only take about 18 to 20 weeks in reception. It's important that children and teachers know the graphemes and phonemes that make up that basic code, first working on the simpler sounds, then the digraphs and trigraphs. They need to be able to recognize words that are made up of those sounds in everyday reading and be able to compose and write words containing those sounds linked to the everyday experiences and curriculum experiences. It's important that as part of all of our practice, we're modeling those skills of grapheme phoneme recognition, segmenting and blending. And that's not just as part of phonics, it's part of every reading and writing experience, including all of that modeled reading and writing we do as enabling adults in our continuous provision and in independent work. It's important that we're the models of reading and writing as well, and we share, we talk about, we model how our knowledge of phonics helps us as readers and writers. And we encourage children to be brave and have a go using what they know as a starting point. Now, it's really easy to teach graphemes and phonemes and recognize those in the context of everyday books. Here's just one, Peck, Peck, Peck by Lucy Cousins. Great, as you can see here, for introducing that digraph CK. You can teach children to do the segmenting and blending with that word that's in the title. You can do those activities where you're teaching children to segment and blend using sound buttons as appropriate, other words with that digraph, so they're used to seeing it in context. Children can read the book and see that word in context and that digraph in context alongside other words they can decode at that level. And you can teach them how to blend for reading with sentences like this. And you can also teach them how to segment for spelling. Here, the bird could peck the cot, the bird could peck the pot. It's got to be done in the context of enjoying the book as well. So don't just do a book for phonics activity. Make sure children get that chance to engage with the book, to enjoy it, and to also understand that there are different cues that help them to make sense of text as well. Yes, the graphophonic cues are important, but also a real rich narrative like this is going to get children to understand the semantic cues, knowing what to expect from the text, using the pictures to support, but also knowing what makes sense in context. And the syntactic cues, the knowledge of grammar, the sentence structure, and knowing how language works. You can give multiple opportunities for children to see graphemes in context with the books that you have on choice in your provision. And yes, there will be decodable readers that help children support that independence into reading as well. We need to remember that no decodable reader is going to provide the richness of narrative, language, and engagement as the book you've just seen, but children do need these texts as a support towards independence. So you'll need to have some of them to draw on to support that too. Just be aware that some are far better than others, engaging real writers and illustrators and sharing much more satisfying storylines that take children beyond the limited text on the page, and always look at the quality of representation that you shared. The goal for us is to make sure that children have that leg up to be independent, not just as readers, but also as writers. Here are some examples of some writing that's come out of our reception classrooms. Children have the power to read whatever they want or write whatever they want when they have that solid grounding in language and phonics. Here you have to say this in a South London accent. You've got the word symmetrical and metamorphosis when children are learning about growing and changing in terms of insects. You've got a menu from the cafe, and also that ambitious language that's going to help children to communicate their ideas and thinking. This is where phonics is at its power. They've learned the skills and now they're using it to become confident readers and writers. Now, this is but a snapshot of everything that we provide as part of our work at CLPE. It's much more widely explained in our reading scales, but also on our programme of professional development at CLPE. Do look that up if you'd like to find out more about phonics in context. Thank you very much.
Charlotte, thank you. That's really grounded us in children, teachers, books. Wonderful. I'm going to pass straight over now to Sandra McNally for her presentation.
Thank you very much, Dom, and I'll just share my presentation. Okay, I hope everybody can see the slides, and I will begin. So in my 10 minutes, I'm going to talk about published work that was an evaluation of the synthetic phonics program that was brought in now quite a while ago, following something called the Rose Review. This is the paper, and there's a link to it. I'm sure the slides will be circulated afterwards as well, if you want to follow up. Up to 2006, the National Literacy Strategy suggested a variety of ways of teaching children how to read. And the formal thing was called the Searchlights model. And there was a variety of programs within that, and that included analytic phonics. Now, after the Rose Review, it was put forward that pupils should be taught synthetic work as their first strategy because this is according to the authors, it is the most effective systematic approach to teaching reading. Now, as before that, there was an early reading development pilot to inform the Rose Review, and within that pilot, local authorities received funding to engage leadership teams and foundation stage practitioners in pilot schools, and there were about 10 in certain local authorities that were pilot schools, and they had an initial cluster meeting for pilot schools and ensuring that schools complete the audit of their provision. And it was part of this that local authorities should prioritise is playing with sounds with all the schools and settings, not only those in the pilot. And larger local authorities use leading practitioners to build capacity and disseminate to other schools. And in the first year of the national, there wasn't a national, after the Rose Review, synthetic phonics was the recommended approach. But to try to implement that, they had a program that was rolled out in different local authorities that replaced this initial pilot. And this was with certain local authorities were invited to join the original 18 local authorities. Each got funding for a dedicated learning consultant that would work intensively with about 10 schools per year. And they provided support to other schools in the local authority as well. And then they continue to do that in successive groups of local authorities. So the idea here is that it's not that straightforward to just implement a new national program, and schools need some help and support to do that. And so that the consultant would work with these particular schools and help them to really know how to implement this new approach, which was so different from what went before, at the same time as trying to advise schools within the same local authority. So what we're trying to do in our research is to evaluate, being a pilot school or being in this special program where you got this consultant to help you implement the new synthetic phonics approach and try to evaluate that. So we're just trying to evaluate what's the effect of being a school like that gets this help from the consultant to implement this new synthetic phonics approach against people in a control school, students in a control school. So the control schools are actually schools that get the consultant later. So it's not that we're not comparing the schools that were selected for the consultant to help them with all other schools because they wouldn't really be comparable. But we're looking at schools that got the consultant at some point over a short number of years. Those are all the schools in our sample. Then we have the schools that got the treatment as our treatment schools, and we use the schools that got the consultant at a later time as our control schools. And our approach, our methodology involves comparing schools and treatment schools relative to the control schools before and after the program took place. I know many of you are not researchers on this, so I hope that I'm not completely losing you with this. But the question is really, is there an improvement for pupils in these schools that were the target of the intervention compared to pupils in schools that were not the target of the intervention, but got involved at a later stage? To do this, we look at the National Pupil Database. This, as you will know, I'm sure, has information on all schools, all pupils in all state schools, and you can see them from reception right the way through school onwards. The outcome measures we look at are the foundation stage profile at age 5, and in particular, the communication and literacy score within that. The teacher assessed Key Stage 1 and the national test at Key Stage 2 at age 11, reading. So we look at reading at age 7 and reading at age 11. So just to say what our treatment group are, we have 2 treatment groups. The treatment group is the first group that was in the pilot. That was the pilot to inform the Rose Review at the same time. And then we have our second treatment group, which is the schools that got the consultant in the first phase of the national rollout, or the CLLD. And then the control schools are schools that subsequently came into this intervention later. Now this graph very simply represents our results. So the points that you see on the graph show an estimated treatment effect. So when it's 0, it means there's nothing. So T-2 and T-1 are 1 year and 2 years before the intervention took place. T is the time of the intervention. And you can see as soon as T starts, there's a big effect of getting this consultant in your school relative to the control school. That effect stays in T+1 and T+2, that's 1 year and 2 years after the intervention, so after the consultant has gone from your school, and falls to 0 again in T+3. T+3 is when the control schools come involved themselves in the intervention. So that makes complete sense that as soon as the control schools become involved and get the intervention, the students are the same as the students in the original treatment schools. We do the same process with this is H5 people's communication and language again, and it's the same process again. So as soon as the interventions happens, there's a big effect on those pupils. Their reading really improves in the foundation stage. And then when the control schools come into the intervention, in T+3 in this case, the effect goes down. This is the next slides show the point estimates of different groups. I don't want to go into it in any detail, and I certainly don't expect people who are not researchers to follow it necessarily. I'll try and explain it as best I can. Just consider the estimate, which is in red, the line I have in red. This shows a very big effect of the intervention when pupils are only age 5. This would be considered an effect of quite a big magnitude, 30% of a standard deviation for people who know what that is, or about 4 to 5 months of additional progress. This is at age 5. Now, and this is for people who got the full treatment. So the consultant had come into the school when they were aged 5. Yes, and then at age 7, the effect is still there, but it's gone down considerably. So the students who got the consultant at age 5, when they got to age 7, there's still a positive impact on their reading scores. And then by age 11, there is nothing left. So by age 11, everybody's caught up. That would be one interpretation of the results. In other words, you can try and make children learn to read faster, which may have many benefits, but mostly children do catch up no matter which way you teach them how to read by age 11. On average, of course, should be concerned with people who are not the average reader, and I'll go on to talk about that in a few minutes. The very same pattern, if you look at the second treatment group that we have, which is the schools that entered the programme in the first year of the national rollout. So what do we learn? There's a big initial effect of the programme on age 5 assessment, which is still sizable, though reduced at age 7. The effect lasts when the consultant leaves the school. So it's not just when the consultant is in your school, it continues to last. The effect is greater for students longer exposed to the programme, but there's a small and statistically insignificant effect on age 11 test scores. Now, I'm not going to go through what all the coefficients mean for everything else, but what we've done is we've looked at the heterogeneity of the effect. So in other words, is there variation in the effect between different groups of learners? So one group of learning that might be vulnerable is non-native speakers of English, people who do not speak English in their own home as a first language. We do find that the effects of the programme do last longer and are stronger for these students at age 7 and even at age 11. That's my timer telling me I've gone on too long, so I'm going to wrap up quite quickly. People on free school meals are also, they are students who benefit more from the programme at age 7 and to some extent in age 11 as well. So it does have a sustained impact on those students. But the most interesting thing of all is if you look at people who are both non-native speakers in the sense they don't speak English as a first language at home and the free school meals, the effect is actually quite sizable, even at age 11. So there's a persistent impact of this reading method as facilitated by the consultant in the school, and that lasts all the way up to age 11 in their test scores. So the cost of this, of getting the consultant to go to schools and help the teachers was actually fairly low, and the effect on the subgroups were actually quite big, and it did last till age 11. And that's, we think, a very interesting and important finding, that actually both introducing this method and having the consultant help schools facilitate this actually really did make an improvement relative to the counterfactual, relative to what was in place before. And I'll end there.
Sandra, thank you so much. We'll pass now on to Rob.
Okay, here we go. So thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to try and make sure I spend only 10 minutes now talking through, so we'll rattle through from this point. Okay, so I'm going to start with the notion that the broad landscape. There's been much debate on whether the whole of language improves reading or whether children need explicit attention to word reading sub-processes. Jean Chow back in 1967 referred to this as the Great Debate. Any of you who followed some of this stuff might wonder how great it has been, actually, because there have been many misunderstandings and sadly some acrimony in this discussion. I'm wondering if some of that is caused by some of the way models have been interpreted. So that's why I'm going to spend a bit of time on this today. And in the English context, reading has for the past 15 years been framed by the simple view of reading, was brought in the Rose Review 2006, and it's replaced a model called the Searchlights model, which was referenced in the previous presentation. So I'm wondering about how these things have been interpreted. So I'm going to spend a bit of time here today. Let's just see. So the Searchlights model looked like this for those people who've been around for a while. It had phonics in it, but it also included the role of context, grammatical knowledge, word recognition, and graphic knowledge, all of them impacting upon word reading. And it was replaced by the simple view of reading, which has two dimensions, one for language comprehension between poor and good, and another dimension, somewhat independent, called word recognition or decoding, variously by the authors of this paper. So superficially, these look like very different models. However, well, okay, let me tell you a little bit more about the simple view of reading. It's often, in my view, been maligned and somewhat misunderstood in itself. I think it's a reasonably good proximal model of reading comprehension, i.e. of the skills that go into reading at that given moment. But I will say also that it's not, I would argue it's not a scientific model in the specific sense that it doesn't make longitudinal predictions. It's a descriptive model. And in science, we typically like to predict the future, right? You know, this medicine will make you well, or this asteroid will not hit the Earth or something. That's what science tries to do. But the simple view reading isn't actually a longitudinal model. It describes decoding or word reading and listening comprehension both as necessary, but not each one of them in themselves sufficient, proximal, or immediate causes. And Bill Tunmer and Goff and Hoover and others in the 1980s and 1990s saw this actually as a way to end the acrimony in the debates. They felt that this model, which was they thought it was a balanced model that included phonics and the whole of language, the linguistic comprehension piece. And they framed it with a little equation because here, reading comprehension is the product of listening, and language, and decoding or word reading. Both of them crucial. One of the ways this model has been misunderstood is that researchers have sometimes attempted to make it a little bit more complicated. So I've kind of parodied this slightly here with the listening comprehension times decoding plus insert your favorite variable here as an approach that many researchers have used, but that's kind of true. In fact, if you measure reading comprehension well, and I'll use the term with a latent variable for the researcher's benefit, if you measure listening and decoding well with latent measures, there's not much variance left. So you don't need to add much else in. It's a very good, simple model of the immediate proximal causes, though it says nothing about what causes that strong decoding or comprehension in the first place. Another key thing that I think is relevant to the policy piece is that some people have assumed that the decoding and listening comprehension components are independent causes. The D or word recognition for words, the listening for texts. Well, that may actually not be a great scientific model because we know from lots of research that oral language is closely involved in word reading. So series of studies here, I won't go through all of them, but just to see that we did this, we found it, various other people in the US have found this work. And crucially, Bill Tunmer, who's the author of The Simple View of Reading, himself says, based upon their own research in 2012, just before he retired, saying that the claims to independence of the two components may need to be relaxed somewhat. And this is what he found. I've got an image for you. This is called a path model, and it describes the pathway or connection between different kinds of processes. On the left, you've got letter knowledge and word reading, and listening and vocabulary. And on the far right, you've got reading comprehension. So it talks about how these might be connected. The simple view of reading says that all those letter level and word level things should impact decoding and should impact reading comprehension, and they do. It also predicts that listening and vocabulary knowledge should predict linguistic comprehension and then influence reading comprehension, and they do. So far, so good. But crucially, Tunmer also found that decoding and listening comprehension as abstract constructs were connected to each other. And crucially, as you can see with the direction of the arrows there, it's the language force that's impacting decoding. So they're not independent. So it suggests that the decoding is improved by the involvement of language in it. This is a correlational model. It's not an intervention. Nevertheless, it's very, very intriguing. So how might language and vocabulary improve and add to decoding and phonics? One of the ideas that we've been exploring is the notion called set-for-variability. It's not a very fantastic phrase, and we've reframed that as flexible phonics in some of our recent trials. In essence, what we're saying is that phonics is very important as one part of reading. It involves phonic assembly. Let's take a synthetic phonic view by assembling the pronunciations of words that follow phonic rules, like dog, but also words that don't. So if you take a word like wasp, and a child might sound that out without knowing as wasp to get wasp, they can't read that word by sight. However, if they use phonics flexibly and perhaps in the context in which they meet that word, particularly in independent reading, this is a learning opportunity and a self-teaching opportunity to learn that word. And I need to emphasize here that this is not guessing. This is not taking a casual approach to the print on the page. It's firmly rooted in phonics, but also bringing other tools to bear. And we think this process hasn't been emphasized a great deal in education historically. Okay, so we teach this to children in the early years. We've run this in Canada and more recently in the UK. We've got a 5-step process, but basically it involves you using phonics, sounding out the word, checking to see if the phonic assembly has produced a word that you know that makes sense in context, and then if it doesn't, doing something about it. So I've got a more visually appealing version of that 5-step piece here with a little bookmark that we give to children. Sound out the word, question, is this a word I know? Flip something around. Flip a vowel, flip a consonant sound in here, try working it out from the sentence, sound out the word, say it, and then write it once you've got the pronunciation correct. So we teach this as a strategy. So here's an example. They don't see the picture in the top right in the first instance, but right at the beginning, they might get, I have a new kite, it has a monkey on it, the monkey flies in the sky, he has a big smile, the monkey is holding a fruit. The fruit is long and yellow. It is a ba-na-na. It is a, and then children have to flip the sounds to work that out. And if they do this, that's great. If not, they get support. And what they're working out is the variable pronunciation of the A, not just an A sound, but it has an R and an sound in banana. So the variability that goes with that vowel. So they're working it out in context. We place that in a model with 5 other aspects. We teach the vocabulary orally for these words, particularly the exception words, so we know that they know them. And we've got some extra pieces in here that I could explain if I had more than 10 minutes. I won't, but essentially it fits in a program that we've been working out over a few years. And I've got some results from Canada. I haven't got some UK stuff yet because the trial results from an EEF trial are imminent this summer, where we train teachers and supported teachers in running it during the pandemic. But this is what we ran in, in a previous study in Canada, and we trained research assistants to go into schools to support children. The blue line is beginning of year 1, grade 1, as it is in Canada. The orange line is them during the Christmas term. They're catching up before we intervened. We intervened after Christmas, so that's the grey bar. And then by the end of the grade 1, you can see that our children in the intervention group, this direct mapping and set-for-variability, have a taller Manhattan for the grey, representing that their reading scores pushing towards 100, which is average. The control group are doing a little bit less well, and they're getting regular phonics and sight word reading, I should say. Finally, we can show an effect 6 months later at a delayed post-test after the summer in the beginning of year 2 to show that we've got some sustained effect. So we're cautiously excited about the idea of direct mapping and set-for-variability. So if I can conclude there, my whistle-stop tour, effective teaching, I think, does involve phonic decoding. There's lots of evidence that's the case. But we also know that effective teaching involves more than just decoding and implies wider language and especially vocabulary knowledge. It may be that strategy instruction in mental flexibility in phonics through set-for-variability, aka flexible phonics, may reflect one pathway by which vocabulary aids word reading and may improve outcomes. The last thing I'd like to mention is that somehow the simple view of reading has been misunderstood as a model of only decoding in English national policy. It was always a model of decoding and comprehension and of their combined use, and in fact their interactive use in reading. So the simple view of reading which is used for policy is in fact a model about balance, and it would be great to see that represented fully there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing what others have to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Rob, very much indeed. Looking forward to picking up your ideas and indeed everyone's ideas. Can I just quickly say to our audience, please do start getting your questions in. We've got some coming in, but we can hopefully deal with more. So as you think of something, just pop it in the Q&A. Sebastian, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be on this panel, to be with all these fantastic researchers whose work I've followed for quite a long time now. So thank you for the invitation. I have a long-winded title because I really want to get at the importance of looking at this question developmentally. And let me just get my slides working. So how I began looking at reading was via a meta-analysis that I conducted quite some time ago now, 15 years ago. And I also was interested in looking at the reading wars and is there any possible way they might be resolved in with a scientific basis. And so for this meta-analysis, I took all studies that had a plausible control group. So that is a matched control group at pre-test, or even better, a randomly assigned control group. I looked at a range of reading interventions for children with disabilities or with children who are at risk of reading difficulty. And I looked at a range of reading interventions, mostly in the phonics, phonemic awareness domain, reading comprehension domain. There was some whole word and some whole language interventions. And if you look at the results of this reading intervention meta-analysis, with the effect size down here on the left and the age of children on the bottom, according to the American grade system, preschool, kindergarten, grade 1, etc., then you see there's quite a clear interaction in that the phonics interventions, which are these lines here, the square boxes, are more effective earlier, and the reading comprehension interventions are more effective later. A significant interaction. And I thought this is quite an interesting finding, but I was also working on something else at the same time. And in this line of work, which actually ended up finding something very similar to what Sandra just presented in terms of the findings, I looked at, okay, so perhaps it's effective to teach reading via phonics when children are 5 or 6 years old. Perhaps that's the best method. But is there actually any point in teaching them at that age anyway, or will they catch up? Why would we spend time and resources doing this if it doesn't actually have any long-term benefit? So I thought that's a very important question to investigate as a beginning basis. And what I found was that by comparing children who enter school systems where they start reading early when they're 5 years old versus school systems where they start later when they're 7, what we see in the data is that we see that there's an early advantage. Children quite early can develop decoding skills. They receive quite a bit of support. This study was conducted in New Zealand. They receive quite a bit of support quite early. And you see as a massive decoding advantage at age 7. However, the children who are just starting to read when they're age 7, via the fact that they attend a different state-funded school system, they quickly catch up. So by age 9, 10, or 11, there was actually no difference. So we have these two kind of findings. One is the advantage for phonics early, and then the advantage of reading comprehension interventions later. Effective way to teach reading. And then we have this kind of contradiction. We have this, okay, but actually the effects kind of wash out. It's very similar to what Sandra found, actually. So I began to think, well, maybe we're not looking long-term enough at the effective reading interventions. So this inspired my next meta-analysis. I still think it's one of the largest, I think it's the largest meta-analysis looking purely at long-term effects. So this was studies, again, with a randomly assigned control group or a closely matched control group that wasn't randomly assigned. And in this meta-analysis, I only included studies that reported follow-up data. So this tends to throw out a lot of the studies, and it tends to, my impression was that it focused the research onto the studies that were more well conducted. Because if researchers are thinking, yeah, I'm going to collect my data long term, they've probably put a bit more care into planning their study. I don't mean to make that as a blanket rule, but in general, what was really interesting about this study is that there was overall an average moderate size of reading interventions of 0.37 that 11 months later, at follow-up on average 11 months later, had reduced to 0.22. But what was perhaps a little bit interesting what is a bit interesting for the discussion today is that if you look at the specific effects for phonics interventions, they are quite modest at 0.29, reducing to 0.07. So that's a small moderate effect reducing to a very small effect on average 1 year later. On the other hand, phonemic awareness interventions, which target a language without introducing decoding skills, seem to have larger effects that were about 0.43, falling to 0.36, so remaining in the moderate area. And interestingly, and also this mirrors what Sandra found, we do see effects that for disadvantaged readers, the effects seem to be more robust and remain longer. But if we just reduce this question to what evidence is there for younger children, so we're talking about under 6, under 5-year-olds. Here is a scatter plot. So basically on the bottom is the effect sizes. So out here is a large effect. Anything blue line and beyond is a large effect. Red line is no effect. We see most of the studies fall into this range. If we reduce it to studies looking at children under the age of 6, suddenly there are a lot fewer studies, some with negative effects. and some in the middle. If we look at our evidence for children under age 5, we find very few long-term studies with solid designs. We had this, we saw the slide, or a similar version presented by Charlotte, and I want to come back to this. It's basically the simple view of reading, which Rob was talking about as well. Language and comprehension skills flow together. My contention is we don't often stop to think about what is language actually. What is a word? What is a concept? How do these concepts arise? How do sounds arise? And what's behind them? Well, we tend to be a bit dualistic about this. We tend to think of concepts as being something abstract, floats around at a kind of an abstract level, and then we have sort of maybe our senses get mentioned, or then they reach the form in terms of words. What I'm quite interested in doing is studying actually what concepts are themselves. But going back a little bit to looking at this this problem here, how do I reconcile these findings? We have these effects washing out, and we have these intervention effects washing out, but we have the powerful short-term effects for phonemic awareness and phonics intervention sometimes, or often. For me, an important understanding was, a breakthrough for me was Scott Parris's paper looking at constrained skills. And if you think about the kind of skills we're targeting, phonemic awareness, there are 44 phonemes in the English language. 26 letters, or 52 if you take large and small. These are kind of skills that can be mastered quite quickly. If you look at something like vocabulary, if you look at how many lexical items there are in a language to acquire proficiency, anyone who's learned a foreign language knows that you need a good number to reach, you know, conversational proficiency, 10, 20, 30,000. So what we're seeing, if we think about these phonemic awareness and phonics interventions and decoding interventions, is we're targeting highly constrained skills, so we get good progress quite quickly. But what we see is that we see a number of children who these effects are kind of washing out for, or they're not really holding. And here's some data from Germany, vocabulary development across the first, or until children were 17, 16 years old. And I just want to show you this spaghetti-like graph, because the squiggly spaghetti at the bottom are the lowest performing children. And what we see is there are some 4 or 5-year-old children who have as good a vocabulary as some 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-olds. So we have a very big intractable problem with our language. It's very difficult to shift language, as we know from language interventions. And we have to ask ourselves sometimes, are we asking the right questions? Are we focusing too strongly on the technical constrained phonetic aspect? Are we focusing on language as a too abstract construct? And are we missing the experience of how images, pictures, content arises from text? This is a deeper philosophical question. And what I've begun to study, and I will wrap up shortly, I believe Dominic's appeared because my 10 minutes are up. Okay, so what I think we might need to diversify out into is studying actually the basis of language, the basis of concepts, and understanding how these are anchored in sensory motor experience, how this relates to language, studying the unique organ of the hand and its evolutionary development, and the complicated interactions that it has with the human cortex. And then we can begin to understand how images arise out of reading. And this is the motivation of reading, is to develop rich mental images, experiences, as well as deriving information from text. So I've overstepped my time. I won't go into this into much more detail. I'll just say that perhaps reading is more than decoding plus language. We could extend the simple view of reading into sensory motor cognition as being a foundation. So to summarize, phonemic awareness does appear to be, or phonics does appear to be, a powerful method to result in short-term gains in children's reading, decoding skills as well. Long-term effects are, for me, quite disappointing. Language is the one elephant in the room. It's very hard to shift as an elephant. It's very hard to improve language through interventions. And I would conclude that we need to perhaps consider, are we asking all the right questions? And we need to perhaps look at broader effects in primary and preschool education. Thank you very much.
Thank you. How wonderful you've managed to link all of the previous presentations and bring us to philosophy. Excellent. So over to Sinead.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to, I think, continue on the philosophical route. I'm not going to spend too long on the what works issues, because I feel that we've had an in-depth discussion on that. We've already heard that, and you'll have a good idea of the latest evidence. What I want to focus more on is issues of pedagogy and research agendas. So touching on what Rob had spoke about in terms of misconceptions, and Sebastian mentioned in terms of deeper questions. So in terms of teaching early literacy, I think we know that teaching children to use academic language skills, develop awareness of speech sounds and how they link to letters are important, decoding, analysing word parts, writing, which I think often gets neglected in our discussions about early literacy, and the reading of connected text is really, really important to support reading accuracy and fluency and comprehension. And we know that systematic phonics instruction is an important part of beginning reading instruction, but that there's inconclusive evidence to claim one method is more superior than others. Touching on early literacy, there are other variables that are really important, and I think that's something that my colleagues have brought up, that there are other things that are happening: alphabet knowledge, phonological awareness, being able to understand concepts about print knowledge, oral language, and visual processing. So one of the concerns or the questions I bring to us as a group are, does an overemphasis on phonics distract us from these other variables? And I show an example of a child that I worked with here who clearly knew that print represented speech and could match some sounds to some letters, but didn't understand that print has rules and moves in a certain direction. In terms of what next, I just wanted to focus on two things really. What do we do for children who are not benefiting from quality classroom instruction? I don't think that that group of children should be neglected from this discussion. And then how do we ensure a successful translation of research to practice and vice versa? And the vice versa is really important. And I wanted to touch on two issues. One is the issue of literacy research operating in silos and the consequences of that, and also about learning from expert teachers. In terms of questions, why do I have a picture of a horse here? Well, I borrowed this from a dear mentor of mine, Sister Elizabeth Connolly, who said, if you discover you're riding a dead horse, the best strategy is to dismount. Now, my first impression when I heard that was that the dead horse was the child, but it's not. It's instruction. And I think we need to really consider when we're talking about what works in terms of literacy, that more of the same is not necessarily the best strategy. So in other words, if children are not making progress, and we talk a lot about what works, what are we going to do to support them? And we can't lose sight of that. So I query if children have had good quality classroom instruction, what do we do next? So the question might be, what works for whom and in what context and in what circumstances, and when it doesn't work, what next? I'm going to move on. Sorry. And we know that this is an issue. We know, for example, in England, that regardless of our opinion of the phonics screening check, we know that 18% of children did not meet expected standards, and that rose when we looked at a group of disadvantaged pupils in terms of the phonics screening check. I wanted to look at another setting, Ireland. Obviously from my accent you can tell I've experience in that area, two vastly different contexts, two vastly different curricula, two different methods of assessment, but still a tale of underachievement. And I think one of the pressing questions in terms of literacy instruction is, when things are getting difficult and when children are experiencing difficulty, we need to be able to ensure that we know that who are the children for this. It's about instruction, or those who have more profound reading difficulties. Okay, one piece of research that I've pursued with my colleague Jake Anders was looking at the impact of reading recovery on phonics screening check. we looked at children who were offered reading recovery during the academic year, year one, and we looked at that subgroup of children who were having difficulty. And we found that children who had got reading recovery early in the school year, 75% of them went on to pass the phonics screening check. If they were still in reading recovery at the time of the phonics screening check, only 45% passed. And if they hadn't had reading recovery prior to the screening check, only 19% passed. So in this design, those who didn't have reading recovery prior to the phonics screening check acted as a control. My point here is that we need to be able to pay attention to those groups of children who are failing and think about what we can do to open literacy up for them. Other questions I have are in terms of translational research agendas. I think we need to be asking ourselves that we need to assess not only effectiveness, so what students are learning, and efficacy, so what teachers are doing, but also how are we as systems learning from and what are the barriers to or enhancements to systems as we implement interventions. I think we've a lot to learn from the Reading for Understanding initiative that's run in the US for the past 10 years. And I think Rob referred to some of the research from it, that they're asking questions like, does the simple view of reading really imply an assembled or orchestrated approach to improving reading for understanding? In other words, is it one thing and then the next? Do we really learn to read and read to learn? What are the skills, and Sebastian touched on this, that are needed to read at different stages of the lifespan? And where are the windows of development for different skills? I think these are really important questions. And I think we could, everyone could do with reading this, the summary of the research that has been carried out and not ignore it. And that kind of moves me on to another issue, and that was the disciplinary silos. I'm really, really happy that we are a kind of a broad spectrum here presenting today, from psychology and education and sociology and economics, because I think that we have a lot to offer. My question, I suppose, is, are these fields working together or creating separate silos, pursuing separate agendas without any crosstalk? And I want to highlight the issue of silos in a way. The lack of consensus is causing confusion for those who teach children. I offer two quotes here that are quite different as evidence of that. I think there's consequences for us in higher education as academic researchers. And again, Rob highlighted this. What works implies value judgments. There are huge issues of cherry picking of research. Rob talked about the simple view of reading being misrepresented. I would argue the same has happened in my area of work, in where the work of Clay has been confused and conflated with, for example, the work of Ken Goodman. And one of the issues is, are we drawing on primary evidence? Are we allowing students and in professional development the opportunity to read lots of research and be exposed to it, or are we cherry picking? And my very last point, because I can see Dom there, is we have a lot to learn from expert teachers. And I draw on the work of the late great Michael Presley, who said it was really important to look at what teachers are doing, because just because we're saying something or we're offering a rhetoric there are many expert teachers who are teaching children to read very well. And we need to look at what they are doing. And I cite two pieces of research there that I conducted with Emily Rogers, where we looked at expert teachers of reading and writing, and they are doing different things, and we do need to pay attention to that. I'll leave it there and hand back to Dom.
Sinead, thank you, it's brilliant.
Right, well, thank you, everyone. This is the last of our talk, so hope we can get into the Q&A after Dom and I have spoken. We're both from IOE, from the Helen Hamlyn Centre for Pedagogy. And we're going to talk about this paper in Review of Education, which arose really out of our kind of shared interest, the overlap of our interests, which for Dom is in a long history of interest in literacy and in reading, and my interest in particularly in assessment and classroom practice and education policy. So we published this paper back in January, and it garnered quite a lot of attention. We also wrote an open letter to the Secretary of State for Education, with over 250 signatories. And we're going to talk about what that paper said. There was also an opinion piece in the Guardian about the kind of over focus on phonics, and we got hundreds of responses on that, and as well as a lot of responses by email and on social media. So there's clearly kind of a real interest in this topic, and I think from parents as well as teachers and academic researchers. And if you may have seen Helen Hamlyn's really interesting article in the TES about how reading wars have become the culture wars, as a good analysis of why do we care so much about this topic. So we're going to talk about, first Dom is going to talk about his sort of section of the paper, which is about the systematic reviews, and then I'm going to talk about the survey of teachers before we finish off by explaining what the DFE responded to our open letter. Dom.
Thank you. So as you can see, we began work on the research leading up to the paper in autumn 2020. And I was pleased to hear us today that other speakers, we've ranged across the details of, graphemes and phonemes, and we arrived at philosophy and then what expert teachers do. And consistent with the way I've tried to think about literacy for many, many years, I do think there's a place for precision and a narrow focus on a particular topic. I think I'm echoing a little bit what Sinead has been saying, because we also need, I think, some of these other things. And so the paper was informed by quite an extensive consideration of the history of policy changes. We carried out some discourse analysis of national curriculum texts. We looked at all the statutory test data that's been published in England since the national curriculum of 1988 was first implemented. But today, I just want to focus, probably as a reminder, but rather important reminder of what systematic reviews have told us. And we developed this idea of a systematic qualitative metasynthesis. And the reason for this is that quite often these really good systematic reviews are not able, for perfectly understandable reasons, to actually get at, in the end, what was the pedagogy in these successful or not successful interventions. And I've always felt that we need to get to that point as well, with a proper, rich contextual understanding behind it, so that the history and so on. And obviously a big part of what we did, as well as review existing published studies, and by the way, I think that's also vital, our new empirical data was the views of 2,205 teacher respondents. So in 2008, Usha Goswami and I had done some work on a paper. We became interested in the debates at the time. A study in Clackmannanshire was heavily cited by Sir Jim Rose, for example, in his report. We looked at that, but we also did a little of what Alice and I have done. We considered systematic reviews, and at the time, just a reminder, in North America, the reading panel had produced several systematic reviews, meta-analyses. That had been challenged in the area of phonics by another team who reanalyzed some of the data for the meta-analysis and came to a slightly different conclusion. So prior to 2008, Usha Goswami and I had addressed systematic reviews. Obviously, since then, there have been many more experimental trials and good qualitative research, although in this paper, we focused our attention mainly on larger scale quantitative studies. I won't go through all of these because I'm conscious I want to get the audience involved in questions. You can see Sebastian's work features there, and indeed that's what took us into our qualitative analysis of the studies. But also all of these are important. I'd perhaps mention the work led by Carol Torgerson and what they said after their robust systematic review. The evidence did not support a phonics-only teaching policy, because many studies have added phonics to whole language approaches. Balanced instruction is indicated. I've been really struck today by, I think every speaker has at some point said, these are not disconnected things. Geoffrey Bower's work, really interesting. Some would say controversial. Indeed, we cite some of the debate between Rob and colleagues and Geoffrey Bower's in our paper to try and sort of acknowledge that this is a contested area. But on our own paper, we said that our findings from the analysis of tertiary reviews, systematic reviews, and from our systematic qualitative metasynthesis do not support a synthetic phonics orientation to the teaching of reading. Instead, they suggest that a balanced instruction approach is most likely to be successful. I would add the caveat that we had in the paper, that we still think there is a need for large-scale, robust, randomized controlled trials carried out in England particularly for typically developing readers. And that's not to say that there are urgent questions to be asked about children with reading difficulties as well. There certainly are. Back to you, Alice, if you can see that.
So the other part we wanted to talk about today, as well as all that extensive work on the literature, was the survey of teachers. And just as a bit of background, my field is in policy sociology, so I'm interested really in kind of how education policy affects what teachers do in classrooms. So and I've been looking before, I've done research on the phonics screening check. So I was very interested when in the autumn of 2020, they decided that the phonics screening check would move to year 2, because it provides a kind of real life experiment of how do people change pedagogy because they've got the phonics screening check in a completely different point than they normally would. That was all because of not doing it because of COVID. So we wanted to survey year 2 teachers and find out about what they were doing, but we also wanted to get as a kind of broader picture about how reading was being taught, how phonics was being taught specifically in primary school. So this is just England, and this is the data from the reception and nursery and year 1 teachers who were part of the survey, taken out the year 2 teachers. So we asked them these 2 questions amongst many others about what were their approach to the teaching of phonics, because we wanted to see how it was fitting in. And we asked them these 3 statements, which I can't fit on the pie chart. So it's synthetic phonics is emphasized first and foremost in my phonics teaching, or my phonics teaching is systematically combined with other emphases, including reading comprehension, or whole text such as picture books are my main emphasis, with phonics teaching derived from examples in whole texts. And you've seen in Charlotte's presentation some examples of how that might work. But we found overwhelmingly that phonics teaching was dominated by synthetic phonics. And indeed, when we asked people to comment further, there are lots of examples of people talking about how teaching SSP discretely and systematically and separately from literacy, a quite common distinction between lessons for literacy and lessons for phonics, which is something we found before. I've found before in qualitative research in schools. And often there's, in some places, there were people describing a distinct sort of different strands of reading, as we've seen in other people's presentations, of having phonics and having comprehension and then reading for pleasure. So we were interested in this finding because it's such a dominant effect of people doing phonics, synthetic phonics first and foremost. And that certainly isn't the case if you talk to people from 10, 15 years ago in primary schools in England. They were not, phonics was not such a dominant force. Sorry, back one, Dom.
Oops, sorry.
And then we also asked, of course, then what does the phonics screening check do? How does that affect your practice in relation to phonics? And you can see that the vast majority of people said it had a significant extent, or to some extent. And that for us is really, significant, because it shows that for all of the research, for all of what we might know works or doesn't work, or any of the kind of trials and interesting academic research, the main thing that is affecting what teachers actually do in relation to reading is the fact that they have to do this assessment. And so phonics, preparation for the phonics screening check is becoming the dominant thing in the teaching of reading. And that government pressure, which is also, I know it's not just the phonics screening check, it's also in the reading framework, it's in Ofsted, it's in ITE, all of that is really affecting how teachers approach the teaching of reading, which that political influence leads us to the open letter.
Which I'm conscious we're up, our time is up, so I will move quickly through this. Alice, I think I'm talking about that, is that right? As you can see, we wrote an open letter to the Secretary of State for Education, and I think it's fair to say the response we got, although it was full, was somewhat disappointing. And I'm just going to highlight now, before we finish, the main reason. It was that rather than engage with the arguments we mounted and our signatories felt were important, the department actually sort of said, well, we've seen people on social media and that's enough for us. And then they took the opportunity to restate their position by cherry picking single studies. And this is a persistent political problem for me, cherry picking single studies to back up an existing policy. And but I think we must leave that there and turn now to the audience questions in no particular order. Charlotte, what are the best types of books to read to students?
I would say it depends on the reading experience, and you need to know a rich variety of text to support those children who are learning to read, but also the books that are going to lift the children ahead above where they are in terms of what you share in terms of reading aloud and teaching books in the classroom. And you also need to know how to tune into children's needs and interests, because one of the motivating factors for getting a child to read is to tune into the things that they're interested in. I'd really recommend, and sorry for some shameless self-promotion, going to CLPE's core books database on the CLPE website, where you can actually filter books by age group and by type of reading book there. They've all been chosen by an expert children's librarian and our teaching team so that they're quality assured for the classroom. Brilliant,
thank you. And this attendee very kindly, they've not got a name, but they say, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation, great speakers and organisation. That's very kind of you. Rob.
Can I just say one quick thing about books that we found when we were trying to work with real books, quality literature, with our intervention? We went to the Children's Book Trust, I think it was, list of quality texts. There are lots of lovely books there. Pulled them out and we used those. However, all of those books are non-diverse in their nature. If you go and work in schools, children need to see themselves in the books. We need diverse quality literature. If we just go to existing lists, there are some dangers. I just wanted to say that quickly.
And I will throw in, from years ago, a project I did in Tanzania where there were literally no books in the school at all, just in case we make certain assumptions. Anyone else on the topic of books before I...
Sorry, Dom, just to pick up on Rob's point, I don't know if people in the audience know about our Reflecting Realities research, which is looking at the quality of representation in children's literature. So we place a really strong emphasis on making sure there are representative books in that list.
Thank you. I'm going to move now to an interesting question. I think it's to do with what Alice mentioned, the culture wars a bit, but I don't know. It says, why is it that the widespread misinterpretation, as the question sees it, has been allowed to get so out of hand, and how can it be put back into balance in England? I guess that's a key practical policy question, but maybe it assumes we're out of balance. Does anyone fancy saying something like that? I mean, I'm looking at you as well, Alice. I think we're allowed to talk now. Balance, anyone?
I'll say, you know, I think quite the sort of political reasoning behind the dominance of phonics in England is it's a bit of a mystery to us, quite why it's become so dominant and then started to affect policy. But I think there is an extent to which it seems very attractive to you know, to politicians to have a kind of systematic way and a solution to getting everyone reading, and a way of doing a skill that can be measured in a phonics screening check. That, as a politician, that's all quite attractive, because once you focus on that particular skill, as Sebastian was saying earlier, you can measure it and you can say, yes, everyone has got their 42 phonemes. So it's quite attractive in that sense, as something that can be measured and you can be seen as successful. And I think many parents will say, oh yes, my child can read, you know, and as a parent who's seen 2 children go through a phonics heavy, you know, learning to read in the last couple of years, you know, you can see how it looks like it's a very successful system, especially at first. So many parents will welcome it. That's partly why I think it's become dominant.
Thank you. And anyone else like to? Sinead, thank you. And then Sandra, brilliant, thanks.
Yeah, and you can see me now. I think it's something that Rob touched on earlier on as well. It's the idea of misrepresentations, I think, seem to have been perpetuated. I consider myself very lucky to have had a doctoral education where I was made to read literally everything and to attend from SSR, the Scientific Studies of Reading Research Conference, to NCTE, to UKLA, and to read and understand different theories. And I think, I mean, as Alice said, there's political motivations behind it and views about how children learn to read, but I worry about unsystematic reviews of reading research and what happens when they trickle down the line, if that makes sense. And by that I mean the cherry picking. I think that's very evident to me at the moment in education.
Thank you, Sinead. Sandra.
Well, I come to this as someone who's an economist, and I don't work on this. This is not my main topic of research, but when we did this paper, I didn't have a prior about what we would find, and we did find. I'm convinced that it's true that, you know, that synthetic phonics, that Rose approach adopted after the Rose Review was better than what went before. And while children caught up on average, the problem isn't the average person who does learn to read through different kinds of methods you can have. The problem is the people who have a difficulty reading because of their background and their home background, who need extra help. And there you did see a long-term impact on those people. So I suppose, I mean, I thought, I'm asking, I suppose, my fellow panelists, why do you disagree with what we found? Do you think we're misinterpreting our own findings? I mean, you say it's a puzzle, but surely isn't the government policy better than what went? Would you go back to before 2006 when there was different approaches? Or would you say actually there has been an improvement, but we see other opportunities to improve? I mean, what's your interpretation?
So very good question. Anyone want to respond to that?
Can I jump in sort of about that, but sort of not? I think the problem with early reading is that it's always been this or that. And actually phonics has always been part of reading, but also so has word recognition, so has using the pictures as cues, so has all of those things. We need to make sure phonics is taught well, that basic code is taught well, but it's more than that. It's moving on from that and going on to your orthography and your morphology, which I would have done if we'd have had 5 more minutes. It's your etymology, it's that interest in words that's going to take them forward. And I think one of the things that's going to allow us to find that balance, if it is possible to find balance, is teachers equipping themselves with the professional knowledge and the subject knowledge to feel like they can develop policy with integrity to what they know works well in the teaching of reading. And I think it's events like this and it's demonstrations of what good practice looks like that will enable that to happen.
Thank you. Sebastian, and then Rob.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on Sandra's point. It's a very important point. And a point back, I'd like to sort of ask you by question, what do you think? So, I mean, from what I can tell is that from my research and from Cunningham's research from the UK as well, that you can basically take 50 hours of phonics instruction with a 5-year-old. You can reach the same levels with probably 10 hours with a 7-year-old in terms of economic efficiency. Does that suggest that instead of, so we're focusing on a constrained skill, a highly constrained skill that acquired an early point in development, when the language is still embedding, when out of vocabulary, out of lexical development, phonemic knowledge is developing naturally out of a love for language, surely that's the foundation for later reading. You know, in terms of efficiency, I wonder if that's particularly optimal.
Yeah. Sandra, do you want to say anything before I bring Rob in?
I have to be careful talking to educational psychologists, because you know so much more about the nitty-gritty of this stuff than myself. I mean, I'm just it's a very simple-minded type of approach. I mean, just looking at what was there, you know, introduced relative to what was there before, and that's all the evaluation is saying. It's not saying there isn't some better way than everything. It's just comparing what's there now relative to what was there before, and what's there now happens to be based on synthetic phonics as the main approach relative to what was there before. And all our findings suggest is that that's better relative to the counterfactual. So I'm not really, don't feel best qualified to comment on other issues. I haven't done research on it, just on that particular issue.
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah, just a couple of things quickly. I think Sandra makes a good point. I think for your evidence shows very clearly for that group of children, this is an optimal approach, it seems, or is more optimal than the previous approach. We need to ask about optimality, and I think we need to look at how that might impact for a range of children. And we want to be mindful of the fact that we want to support the high achieving child as well, and they're not constrained by a curriculum at the high end, for example. One caution, if I may, just there's been a lot of discussion in the literature, and perhaps it's implicit here, about long-term effects. It's been people have rightly turned to this, and many disciplines it's very hard to find long-term effects. There's no long-term effects of research on flossing your teeth or many mental health interventions. It's actually quite hard to get really good long-term data. And the point I want to make is, when we run interventions and we follow them up, we're not in those schools in the interim. We go away and do something else typically. We don't know what's happened in the intervention or the control schools between the intervention and the follow-up period, typically. In some cases, in Sandra's, we're actually given the intervention to the control group, so they've actually got it at a later stage. In other cases, we just don't know. And until we collect data on what happens in the interim, we're in danger of making false analysis of what happens in the long term. The biggest danger right now is the false negative, right? We've got this thing where we say, well, we can't find many effects at long-term follow-up, but look at what would a good controls group school do? You know, after the intervention, they've still got all those struggling readers. Any school worth its salt would say, right, we're going to intervene. We're going to do what we can. We're going to go and do stuff. And so they might do more than the intervention school in the interim. This methodologically is called the John Henry effect, right? The controls try and catch up with the intervention. It's a known effect. So until we have that data, we have to be careful. I'd worry if we interpreted long-term effects in the negative of those short-term advantages we're now seeing of phonics. And we then also have to ask questions about optimality for everybody. So just a caution there on these comments at this stage.
Sandra, I've got a quick observation, of course, and I think it's wonderful that you're here, and it's great that you're bringing a different disciplinary perspective. And we work with, in my department, we work in, there's a centre called CEPEO, and there are a number of economists in that centre who we work closely with. I mean, the other thing I would add is, of course, your data is the test data. And so, for example, there are things to do with teachers teaching to the tests. You know, how can we separate, if teachers have got very good at teaching to the tests, are we seeing are children really developing at the rates the increased test outcomes might suggest? We tracked the way that the tests in England have repeatedly changed. And then finally, there is obviously you were looking at a particular time, and what we do know is significant policy changes. We track a trajectory of significant policy changes, which we say have intensified, particularly since 2014. So yet again, we're in a different context. So I think, yeah, delighted you're here, and I think your evidence is really important because it's all part of this picture of what's going on and what should we do next. Now, how are we doing for time, in fact? Right, we need to crack on. I'm going to find another question now, something a bit different if I can. There was one about, so this is from Tracy Grant, who says, really interesting speakers. As an advisory teacher of SPLD and SLCN, I find the reading framework, this is the latest one, which has Nick Gibbs' name at the front of it. I find the reading framework a challenge when I suggest that children who haven't got phonics by Key Stage 2 should try other methods, including precision teaching. any advice. So this is this difficult issue, isn't it, around children who haven't progressed as we'd hope. And at the moment, there is, I know this anecdotally, there's quite a lot of pressure simply to keep doing more and more synthetic phonics. So, and by the way, we did have some contact with the British Dyslexia Association after our paper came out, and they were concerned about this very same issue. Do we just keep going? Anyone want to say anything about the needs of our struggling readers?
Jump in if no one else is. We did quite a lot of work on this, and it goes back to where I started. It's knowing your children and knowing what their needs are. And with a lot of those children, we find it's the aspects of early phonological awareness that are missing with those children, and also tuning in very specifically to what they need. So it's really hard to give broad brushstroke advice as to deal with all of those children as a group, because they're going to have very, very specific and individual needs within them. But I would refer you to the CLPE reading scales, which offer a wide range of advice of how to tackle reading holistically. The great thing about the reading scales is that they look at beginning and early readers at the older stages of reading. So it's not just about doing the same thing that they would have done earlier on in their reading career. It's about that specific targeted teaching for children at that older age range. And again, it's the choice of books with those children as well. It's making sure that the books that you're giving them aren't patronizing to them. They target their emotional literacy level at that stage while also being accessible in terms of reading. And again, I'd refer you back to CLPE's core books and the Learning to Read collection for Key Stage 2 children, because all of those books have been specifically targeted at that emotional literacy level for those older early readers.
Thank you. Yeah, Rob.
Sorry, I hope I'm not saying too much. I'm going to be quiet after this. We don't have much evidence on what to do at this level. So if you have, tier 1 good regular teaching, tier 2 intensive interventions, tier 3, what do we do for these hard to remediate children? We don't have a great evidence base. We're in the territory of case studies. So any advice we give comes within that context. There was a report by Joe Torgerson and colleagues a few years ago about what to do for adolescent struggling readers, which might be relevant here. And he made the point that they have some modest phonological awareness, but maybe, they may only be able to bring syllables to the table or rhymes or something, not phonemes. But you work with what you've got, and you might attempt to bring morphology, the word meanings, and orthography, the spelling system, to try to bring to bear in there as other resources around the limited phonology that they might have.
Thank you, Rob. And no, you're not talking too much. That's great. So finally, then, a final question, I think a topic we've not particularly mentioned. This is about how should new teachers be trained in relation to the evidence and what's likely to work. And the anonymous attendee has said this: I worry that new teachers are not getting a balanced education on how children learn to read. Training seems to be focused on phonics and not on strategies that are used by programs like Reading Recovery. Well, Sinead, with the mention of Reading Recovery, perhaps I could come to you, and then others can chip in afterwards, and then we'll have to.
I mean, I think it's interesting because it's like Reading Recovery doesn't have phonics. It does. That's one thing to say. I do worry if teachers are not given the professional respect to be offered different perspectives on reading, and then to be able to make the decisions and reflect on their teaching decisions. I think that to me is one of the problems. Like that teacher says, you've got to be able to look at the children who are sitting in front of you and be able to make decisions, having a good knowledge of what works, but also being able to reflect on what's in front of you. I think that's something that Charlotte said there. If we only focus on phonics, then there's a whole range of other things that get lost in that space, and that's language, morphology, comprehension, and so on. And I think that's difficult. I also think if you've a very strong testing agenda, that puts a huge amount of pressure on teachers to get children to a point where they can't make decisions responsibly themselves. I don't know if that's answered the question really.
Yeah, Sebastian.
Sebastian, yeah.
I really liked what you just said. I agree with that entirely. We've got to train teachers to look at different aspects of child development with a train their eyes and trust them to do their job. And they will need to draw from a variety of sources for some children. But as Rob says, we're in a grey zone regarding evidence. And I just wanted to point out one thing that I find quite funny, and that is, my home country, we have the Reading Recovery Program developed by Dame Marie Clay, the late Dame Marie Clay, and then we have Bill Tunmer's work, spent a lot of his life banging, arguing against reading recovery and saying we need phonics, and both have featured it quite prominently today. Yeah. So I thought that's quite interesting.
And so it goes on.
And so it goes on.
Well, yes, and this can't go on, sadly, for now, but we will reflect on what might come next. But most of all, I just want to say thank you to you all. Such different perspectives, so many intersections, such a genuinely fascinating conversation. Thank you, audience, for your questions as well. And thank you for turning up in such large numbers. Much appreciated. I'm just going to finish with a little plug for work that Alice and I are doing, which takes us right into the trying to work within the political domain, but let the evidence speak. We're leading the Independent Commission on Primary Assessment in England. We've started work on this. We have a very good team of commissioners, and at some point soon we're going to have to draft the report. So for those in the audience who are interested in the assessment questions and how they might be in future, and thank you, Sandra, for your direct message. I did read it, just didn't get around to responding to your quite well-made point that, of course, in your study, the same conditions apply to the same test conditions apply to the control schools and the intervention schools. But for now, it's a very warm goodbye. Thank you so much, and hopefully we'll be in touch with you again in the future.